Thereafter, over the course of several months, it soon became well known by many people of the world that Henry Goldman, the inventor of the machines, was an advocate for animal liberation. All throughout the world, he was notorious and acclaimed for the marvelous things he had invented, especially the machines. Many people knew him solely because he invented said machines. But because of his fame, people were now talking about the fact that he was condemning the enslavement, the confinement, the torture, and the slaughter of animals. 5 months after his speech at the Interstellar Exploration Convention, Henry was at a university preparing to speak to hundreds of students. By this time, Henry had been traveling all around the world, speaking to all kinds of people about the widespread system of violence that animals are perpetually being subjected to. And many people hated him for it. There were many times when he was ridiculed and assaulted. Every now and then, when Henry was discussing the notion of treating animals with respect and of not exploiting them, someone would become irate over such an idea. People often searched for holes and fallacies in such an idea. They often made attempts to reprimand such an idea, but not always. Sometimes there were people who believed in the things Henry spoke of. 4.5 years after he had created the machines, and after he had spoken to many thousands of people about the atrocious experiences animals are forced to go through, he was sitting at his workstation in front of an incredibly powerful computer. This was the computer he had used to design the machines and their program. He was clacking away at the keyboard, typing ever so swiftly and exactly. Long strings of lines flowed across the screen as he did so. Usually there were assistants who sat at nearby computers in order to help Henry with such taxing tasks as building new codes. But this time he was alone. It was night. If any of the other engineers saw what he was doing, they'd have grounds to have him sent to prison. Of course, he was allowed to be there at that facility during night hours, and he was allowed to work alone. It was a fact that he had hacked into the mainframe that controlled every machine on the planet, and altered it drastically. He had altered it in such a way so that he could now create an entirely new program for the machines, and so that if he were to do so, that the changes he could make would be irreversible. He was creating a new code that, if installed, would prevent his creation, the machines, from ever being monsters, from ever being tyrants. It would ensure that they could never be used to do harm. It would also ensure that the machines could feel something such as empathy. He typed and typed incessantly for hours. At 1 o'clock, he took a little nap, and then at 2, he continued working. When the sun had risen, and when his coworkers were on their ways to work, Henry had erased all of his tracks, and had left his work to be continued at a later time. He went home at 5 o'clock a.m. and slept for the entire day, and when the sun was setting again, and all of his coworkers were leaving work, he returned to the facility and continued working on the code. He wanted it to be flawless. He wanted so that when the program was finally installed, his machines would be perfect in his eyes, and perhaps in the eyes of those whom the machines would affect. He was an old man. He did not want his machines, his most prized creation, to be something evil. He did not want his legacy to be something that bolstered violence. Rather, as he sat there building the code, the new program, he dreamed and hoped that if he were to leave something behind after he died, that it would be something dignified, something he could be proud of. He imagined that perhaps centuries after his death, there was still life all over the world, being cared for and protected by mighty, deathless, benevolent machines. Although it was not just that he wanted his machines to be perfect in his eyes. As he sat there working on that powerful computer, he had not hacked into the mainframe and was not building up a new code just to make himself feel better about himself. He was also thinking of all those victims whom he had never known before he had created the machines. Those victims, those animals who screamed and cried and bawled and suffered at the hands of the aberrant machines he had created. When he was finally done with it all, and felt that there was not much more that could be added to the code, he took in a deep breath and exhaled loudly and elatedly. "It's done," he said. He stared at the computer screen for a couple of minutes, and then began going through the computer system's records and covering his tracks. He ensured that none of his coworkers could discover what he had done to the mainframe. But he had not yet installed a new program. He was unsure of when to do so, or even if he should do so. More than anything, he wanted to install the program, but if he did, he would get in trouble. If he installed the new program, first, the machines in charge of massacring, subjugating, and stuffing animals in prisons would suddenly stop. They would refuse to carry out actions they were commanded to do, such as castrating and mutilating piglets or chickens and so on. And if they were commanded to continue the work of throwing the male baby chicks into macerators, they would bluntly refuse, and would instead direct their actions for the good of all parties involved. Once everyone would have realized what had happened, Henry and all of his relatives and close friends would be taken into custody. It was a dystopian society. If Goldman were to insurrectionarily install the program, the ascendancy would have imprisoned him and everyone he knew, and would have tortured them forevermore. With the new program completed and ready to be installed, Henry was afraid of going forward and going through with it. He thought maybe he could cover his tracks just enough so that not a single soul could ever prove that it was him who would have altered the machine's program. But even if no one could prove that it was him, still, those in power would still know that it was him, and would still persecute and torture him and his family. All he could do now was what he had been doing before he had started creating the new program. Talking to people, and spreading the notion of nonviolence through discussion. He continued traveling across the world, giving speeches and doing other such things. There were many times when he thought about just installing the new program that he had created and accepting what may come. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He argued with and chastised himself constantly during those days. He could not face the reality of being the reason him and his family members were being tortured by the ascendancy. But on the other hand, he thought that if he installed it, the brutality and torture that the ascendancy would inflict on him and those whom he cared about would be a necessary sacrifice. And he thought maybe his machines could protect him from the ascendancy. Still, though, Henry waited and waited, hoping that what he was already doing was enough. Unfortunately, he waited too long. He was just a drop of water in an ocean of caring individuals. There were millions of people who were already fighting for, or had begun fighting for, what he was fighting for. A young man had asked him to speak at a very special event, and on the day of that event, there were tens of thousands of individuals there, marching with each other, as one thunderous voice, demanding an end to torture, an end to slavery, an end to murder, and an end to the systematic exploitation of the most oppressed group of beings on the planet. And Henry was marching with them, so full of joy that he was not alone. They marched through the city streets for 7 miles, and when they had finally arrived at their destination, they all crowded around the stage that carried massive speakers. Many people gave speeches that day, and there was so much cheering and clapping on the audience's part, so loud that the buildings shook. And then it was finally Henry's turn to speak. He was introduced to the immense crowd, and he walked up onto the stage, and a microphone was given to him. There was a speech in his head that he had memorized before coming to the march, and he was ready. He felt a beating in his heart, a great courage and resolution. He looked out at the people in the crowd, but just as he was about to begin speaking, he suddenly lost consciousness. His head opened up and shot back as blood spattered out, and he fell to the floor. And then a gunshot sound rang through the air. People began screaming, and as more gunshots began to ring through the air, people began falling here and there. There was terror and chaos as blood was spilt that day. A sniper was perched at a windowsill, killing them. There were bags beneath his eyes that looked down at his targets. Beady, bloodshot eyes. I approached Henry's dead body, and I stared. This is how he died, thought I, broken-heartedly. He had grown old, had lived for 88 years, but he was like a child in my eyes, so vulnerable. A creature that touches the soul, earthly, frail, and pitiable because of their transient temper and helpless nature. Seeing him there sprawled on the floor with blood coming out of his head struck a deep grief within me.